everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Emily Louie, and on behalf of Campbell Company, I would like to welcome you to Looking Ahead in 2020, Emerging Trends in Philanthropy. Thanks for joining us today. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly go through some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. If we move to the next slide, you'll see a few tips that we have. First, please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. Next, we recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. And finally, if you experience visual issues, please send a chat to Campbell Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you'll earn one continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Sorry about that.
We always have sirens in DC.
Within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate. In that same follow-up email, you'll also receive a link to download today's slides along with a link to the recording. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. Please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer. We will also hold time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vice President Jeff Wilflow.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And a little background noise here. We're about 3 blocks from George Washington University Hospital, so always some excitement coming out of here. We are at the Chronicle Philanthropy headquarters. Thank you very much, Stacy Palmer, for hosting us. And I wanted to start by introducing our panel. And first, thank you very much, Mady Henson, for joining us.
Thank you.
Mady is the President and CEO of Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, and she has at least more than 25 years of cross-sector experience from nonprofit to philanthropy to corporate and education and even public sector. Mady was the CEO of Covenant House of Greater Washington before she came to what we affectionately call RAG. She was the Deputy Superintendent for Alexandria City Public Schools, a great experience in education, was the President and CEO of Hands-On Greater DC Cares, the Vice President at United Way Worldwide, and led her own diversity consulting firm called Strategic Vision. So great cross-section of information. Thanks so much for experience. Thanks so much for joining us. And Stacy Palmer, the editor of the Chronicle Philanthropy, our partner in crime on this annual Emerging Trends webinar for many years. Stacy was actually a founder of Chronicle Philanthropy back in 1988. I think I did the math, you were 12.
Yes, I was.
You were a child prodigy. And she saw this as a way to get out of her cubicle at the Chronicle of Higher Education by starting her own publication, and they're right down the hall and still very supportive. So Stacy has great breadth of experience and great perspective on this sector, and also does her own volunteer work and fundraising work as a graduate of Brown University, very involved in the alumni program there, and is currently a member of the Women's Leadership Council. So thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to dive right in. We are talking about emerging trends. We do this on an annual basis, and sometimes they're the same, but we see them evolving all the time. There have been a lot of changes this year. So I'm going to start with one of the first ones, and coincidentally, if you haven't seen it yet, the Chronicle Philanthropy has just come out with their own version of Vision of 2020 and what's happening. And one of the first things you highlighted in there, Stacy, was trust and accountability and the erosion of trust in the nonprofit sector. So why don't you tell us a little about that? What are you seeing, and what do we need to be paying attention to and worrying about?
And trust and accountability has been on the list for a long time, but the reason we called it out as a concern is that it is at especially worrisome level. Certainly we're seeing trust in all institutions going down. As a member of the press, I know that my trust is way down, so compared to other organizations, certainly nonprofits still fare well, but only half of Americans trust nonprofits to do the right thing. And 20% of them feel that they are very highly confident that nonprofits will do the right thing. Now, that means a lot of different things, but those are worrisome numbers. The other thing that the experts are really concerned about is when it used to be that people were losing faith in government, as they have in many ways, that they would turn to nonprofits and trust would go up in nonprofits. At this point, what's happening instead is that trust is higher in business rather than in nonprofits themselves. Nonprofits have lost some ground compared to business. So that's why some in the sector are really raising some alarm bells and trying to dig in deeper and say, what's really behind this? Can we better understand the research? So independent sector is doing some research in 2020 that will really look at this by socioeconomic status, by race, by ethnicity, to sort of say, are there patterns within, we can look at that overall number of Americans, but where are their strengths and where are their weaknesses, and what can we do about it? Certainly we see the high-profile scandals like Epstein, and we just saw the report that came out of MIT about them accepting money from that, the Sackler money, some of those protests. While those things are definitely issues and causing questions, what we found in our reporting is that one of the really big concerns that average Americans are raising is this issue of, how are you using my money? Do I trust? Are you coming after me too much just because you want to pad your own accounts rather than how are you doing good? There seems to be a lack of understanding about the impact that nonprofits have, and that feeling among some donors that they're ATMs. And that's something that we can all do something about. So while you can't necessarily deal with the fact that there are going to be scandals, like the Epstein case, obviously we can work individually to prevent them. I think what's more important is to say, how are we showing donors the impact, why their gift really matters? It's never been more important.
That's great. Thank you. And Mady, you represent Grantmakers at the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. What are Grantmakers looking for when it comes to accountability, and what questions are they asking that we should be prepared for?
I think and Stacey talked a lot about it, this sense of uncertainty. And, when and that's cutting across many systems that, people have felt very strongly about. And suddenly now there's question around how any of them are operating. Mm-hmm. And with that, people just retreat with that process. And so from a Grantmakers perspective, you're also looking, and you want to make sure that you're being good stewards of the funds that you have, and that you actually are partnering in those spaces and places that are going to give and make the greatest good around that. So accountability, I think, has risen of how, in fact, can I be sure that these funds actually are doing the greatest good. And so then you get to a whole nother space of how we're measuring and what the agreement is around those measures. And is it qualitative? Is it quantitative? I think there's more of this sense of trust is moving towards. We need to be a little bit more quantitative than qualitative. And yet on the other side, you've got organizations that are doing good or feel they're doing incredible work and are saying, I don't know how to measure this. And how can we speak in the same language about what we're doing? And so, I think it is a point in time that we all have to and are looking for ways of increasing the trust between each other, and that really will help us move further down the ball down the pipe towards being more accountable, but also continue to do greater good. So I'm not always just looking over my shoulder wondering, am I measuring it? Mm-hmm. But am I measuring that is going to matter? And also, am I also not forgetting about things that I don't quite know how to measure yet, but I absolutely know needs to be attended to.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And we find that with our clients, they keep asking, well, what should we be focusing on? Yeah. And it's your job to tell your donors how you're measuring your effectiveness and if you're being effective. You need to tell them what your goals are and if you're meeting them, and if not, why not, and be candid about it. And I think donors will stay with us as long as they know that we're being honest with them about what's going on. So it's only been the last couple of years that we stopped talking about the Great Recession and the impact that had on fundraising. Right. So, of course, now we need to start talking about the next recession. What impact is what's going on? We're hearing this a lot. I know that I get asked this all the time by boards of directors and senior staff thinking about going into a campaign. Would this be a bad time to start a campaign? What happens if a recession happens during a campaign? Well, obviously we don't know when it's going to happen or if it's going to happen, but there will be something, and it is going to affect us the way they always do. But you addressed this as well in the Chronicle, Stacey.
Yeah. As we were working on this cover package for January, we went up and down in terms of the projections of, is there going to be a recession? Is there not? Remember, over the summer, everybody was really pretty sure that one was imminent. And now it feels a little less so. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop talking about it, thinking about it, and preparing it for. It is inevitable. There is going to be a downturn, whether it's this year, next year, 2 years from now. At some point, economic cycles are what they are, and we're going to face it. And the best time is, while times are relatively good, is to prepare for them. And all the experts that we've talked to have said, nonprofits don't do enough to do some contingency planning, to make sure that they're thinking about what would happen, to think about it, do you have 6 months of spending capability if something really bad happened? One thing to think about before I talk about a little bit more about some of the things you might be doing now is to realize that while the Great Recession was obviously very troubling for a lot of people, even that did not have as big an impact on nonprofits as it did on business and on other parts of the economy. Nonprofits are relatively well insulated from the recession compared to other parts of society. So we do need to prepare, but we don't need to panic. And I think there's almost a tendency to do that. That's why people don't want to talk about recession, because you feel like you're bringing it on in some way. But it's something that you can manage in various ways, and think about it. Bridgespan has a great paper that's 10 steps to take to prepare for the recession that you can download from their site. We have a link to it on our site. I think that's a super thing to be as part of your board meetings, to make sure that people are talking about these things and getting engaged in what they can do. As Jeff said, I don't think you should hold back on your fundraising or worry about campaigns, but you need to recognize that these things are going to happen at some point. I'm curious what maybe we'll think about this, because part of the thing is talking to your grant makers and making sure that they're thinking about this. How are they going to help you? Are you prepared to have that kind of conversation to say, this is what we learned last time, this is what we might need, because they should be thinking about it as well and being prepared. Are you hearing people talking about recessions?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, because I think different parts of the country are talking about it more or less. Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers is a member of the United Philanthropy Forum, which is a national organization, and so my sister organizations as well, and having just come off of a national meeting together with CEOs across the country around this. And so I would say it's at a height in some places of the country, and I think it's aligned with where the recession hit the greatest, that you see people a little bit more concerned about, is it next? And to some point of, the focus on, is it coming, is it not coming, that, there could be some paralysis that's taking place. I don't know that we need to move forward with some things because it may come. And there are other places in the country where I think people have aligned themselves with believing that we're preparing for this, but we're not going to stand still around that process. I think that you see, particularly in this region, around members of our organization, is that, people helped and jumped in and helped to support it. Stacey said there's some insulation that's there. I think that philanthropic organizations and grant makers actually helped to support what was going on, that some of those nonprofits were feeling in that, and particularly here. And it's interesting, because I think different places in the country, you have your different forms of recession. So you had, government shutdowns, or feel like a recession while they're happening. And, in this region, as well as other places across the country where there was great presence around that, you really saw some folks really stop and retreat and try to figure out how I'm going to manage through it. And you also saw philanthropic organizations jump in to help create some emergency supports around that. So I think that's where we all are, and I think you're right. You've got to be present. You've got to make sure that you're preparing for it, but not be paralyzed by it.
Right. I was going to mention how many grant makers did step in. Many of the larger foundations stepped in and did more than their usual amount of giving, more than their usual percentage of giving to help out organizations. But I also felt like I noticed afterwards a little bit more conservatism coming from both grant makers and individual donors, larger donors, saying, wait a minute, let's not get into that situation.
That's right.
You've seen that? Yes. Is that still affecting the thinking in grant making?
I think that's that sense of, being alert, being aware And I think fiscally and being responsible around it, I think that is part of what needs to go into this. As Stacey said, we know that something is coming. You don't know how much, you don't know when, but I think as a result of what everybody went through in the 06-08 period in that process, I think people are going to be a little more ready this time than not.
I also think it goes back to the trust and accountability issue that they're asking harder questions. They're taking a harder look at our business plan. They're saying, you know, this is not just that you build it and it will come, you know, how do you know and what happens if you don't get the funding and what happens, you know, so we have to have several levels of answers.
And yet there's still great need that's out there.
Right.
And so, and because the need is great, and then you also have some conservatism that is, in some regards, you got to look at how do I have some alignment around this, because I've got to take care of some things that are also going on, and yet at the same time, that's why you see this movement towards looking at system solutions versus just working at the service level at all times around this.
Right.
And it puts additional urgency on what nonprofits need to think about all the time, which is diversifying your revenue.
Absolutely.
And, you know, that's the positive thing you can do that is good for you in any case, but that's what can protect you when, you know, as you mentioned, things like the government shutdown. Well, you know, that means that if you're very dependent on government funds or government workers, then that's a problem. But if you have other forms of income, it won't hit you this hard.
Right. So while we're talking about Grantmakers, another area that's near and dear to your heart, Mandy, you want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing lately now? I want to frame this. I think there's been a lot of focus in the sector and in business as well on diversity, equity, inclusion. But your Grantmakers are looking at it a whole different way, really going several levels deep in terms of the kind of things you're doing. You want to talk to us a little about what's on their minds and how we meet them where they are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the interesting, but I think also exciting movement that's happening here is the recognition that equity and inclusion are incredibly important. That if you're looking at how do I really make a difference in what's happening in the communities that we serve and that we care about, it doesn't mean that everything is equal across the board. It means that I have to look at this with an equitable lens. And, you know, even in the greater Washington region, we actually have moved and through much analysis, look at it through a racial equity lens in that process. And that really simply means that there may need to be more that is happening here in order for there to be some equity so that everybody has equal opportunities, and it won't matter what your zip code is or what side of town that you came to or what school you even went to, and it will not be a predictor of your success in that process. I think Grantmakers have taken this very seriously and looking at, you know, how do we step into this? And so there's both an internal component of operationalizing it internally in their own organizations, but also externally. How do we work with our partners in the community? How do we actually help them to really think about who you're serving, who's leading those organizations? Do you have those that have the lived experiences and understand that, and are we making the greatest movements around that process? And so I believe that it is one of those areas now that it's not about a fad, and are we going to do it today? It is really about a movement that really talks about how do we get at some of those systems that are going to create more equity across the board for all of our communities that we care about.
Excellent point. Stacey, what are you seeing?
We're seeing definitely a lot of interest and I would say concern among some of the grantees about how well is this working, how fast is it working. There's a lot of talk about racial equity, but sometimes, you know, foundation boards, nonprofit boards, sometimes they end up stalling progress.
Excuse me. They can get in the way.
They can get in the way. And we did a survey among some of our readers and found that there was greater interest and awareness of the issue and concerns among the staff level rather than CEOs of nonprofits. So in some ways, we need to make sure that everybody is really making this front and center, or else we're not going to see change. So I think, you know, there is great momentum, much more than we've ever seen before. So that's exciting. But where are the pockets that get in the way?
I was just going to add to that. That's exactly right. And so I think as a community, as an entity here in this region, as one of the efforts that we are moving forward is we have a race equity summit. And that's something that's going to happen in this summer, on June 11th, 2020. And it is about race equity and the future of Greater Washington. It's really, really a call out for those cross-sector leaders to come together to really talk about how do we collaborate on this? How do we understand best in practice of what's going on here? How do we create a regional scorecard that we all can be held accountable in this particular area? And it's those incredible, I think, call-outs. It's those opportunities to educate, to heighten awareness, but to also help to create this sense of urgency that there is a urgent issue here and that we don't want to take our eye off of it. And I think that's a part of what has to happen, community by community.
Right. And your point about how long it takes, I mean, we adopted this as a firm as one of our key priorities a couple of years ago, and as you said, it's not a fad, it's something we have to keep working on.
Right.
And we're making progress, but it takes time. And we're also finding, as you were saying, this isn't just something we do internally, it's something we also want to share with our clients, and it's also something we want to help the rest of the sector with as well. So we're all working together trying to make this more effective. But we'll be hearing more about that for sure. So let's talk about the next one, which is this one's been worrying us for a while. Fewer households giving. The dollars are going up, but the number of people donating the dollars is not. So number of issues we've looked at, and the effects of tax law changes and how that's impacted people's giving. Has it impacted their giving? Back again to the issue of trust and impact, people questioning whether or not it matters, whether their philanthropy actually works. We heard questions about whether we're even counting correctly, whether we're even getting all of the donations that are being made, especially with tax law changes, people not having to file anymore. Do we know, especially at the smaller level, the smaller donations, and then how do we bring people back if in fact we are losing with this rate? What's going on? So Stacey, you got some suggestions for us in this area?
I mean, the research that just came out of the Lilly School suggested that over the past decade and a half, 20 million fewer households are giving. So there are a lot of questions about what's really been going on, but that data, which isn't just looking at tax issues, but really is looking at a survey of what donors actually do, is pretty worrisome. And we have been seeing this slide. It's over a long period of time. But clearly people aren't feeling the need to give to nonprofits for a whole host of reasons. Some of it is about, lack of interest in going to religious services. We know that it's very important when people are religiously involved, they give to causes that aren't just about their congregation, but they also give to other causes in the community. So it's really, it can be changes. That some of it is triggered by the last recession. People got out of the habit of giving. They couldn't afford to give. There's a feeling that it's, especially in the middle class, people are hard hit. The wages haven't come back in the way that we've seen, certainly this great inequality where very wealthiest can afford to give, and they are giving, but we don't necessarily see it at every level. And that is just, very worrisome to our democracy, that there are not as many people who feel engaged and want to give. So, certainly people are talking about what can we do. The idea of trying to change the tax law is very popular. We ran a piece a couple weeks ago from the leaders of a number of very big nonprofits saying, please, Congress, you really hurt us. You promised us that we wouldn't be hurt as much as we were, and we need something of a universal charitable deduction that anybody can take, regardless of whether you itemize, don't itemize, the tax law changes, that everybody would be able to get that. And that may make a difference, but really it's more about talking about the impact, how your gift makes a difference. As people see these $100 million gifts being made, I think the average $10, $50 donor says, why should I bother? Do you need my money? And obviously nonprofits do in many ways, but that case isn't being heard. So it's more important than ever to explain where the dollars are going, why they make a difference, and especially to causes that aren't as popular with the very wealthiest Americans. We all know that it's community causes, social services groups, all those organizations, they aren't the ones that are necessarily getting those big checks from the very wealthy. We need to find some ways to help these organizations make the case, and that may take, a bigger organization sort of talking about this issue on behalf of the smaller ones in some kind of way. But we definitely need to do things differently because this decline is not stopping, and we all want to do something about it.
Yeah, I support that. When you talk about the diversity of revenue sources, and many nonprofits have positioned themselves to look at these different pools and pockets, and individual giving was a significant role, and particularly, as you say, grassroots human services organizations depended on, those small givers to actually continue to support them through some of those times, particularly end of year. And so what you saw was just a very big change in what was happening there. And I would say in some regards, no real time to readjust for that. Mm-hmm. And so, how to get back at those individual givers that right now, as you said, I think in many cases, you are seeing the mega givers that are out there, and people are saying, well, my $100 isn't going to make a difference in that process. And yet it makes significant difference when you're talking about those organizations. How to get back that level of, I don't know if it's trust as much as really, reestablishing what that need is. Creating a bigger understanding, a heightened understanding about what those individual gifts are doing. And so folks are working really hard at trying to figure out how to do that. But there's a huge gap that's sitting there. And no one's figured out how to fill that gap. Philanthropically, that is not going to be filled at the level in which, as you said, because it's not slowing down. And so how do you turn this tide? I think it's one of those challenges that we need to be thinking about, particularly as we say some of those really grassroots organizations that are important to our democracy and our communities out there.
I think one model, you can look at is the growth of Giving Tuesday, which really has grown phenomenally.
Absolutely.
That's often getting very grassroots kinds of funding. Yeah. It's getting people excited. Yeah. It is getting a younger generation of people getting engaged. Mm-hmm. And most of the giving on that day is unrestricted dollars. So it's money that people can use. And, as that organization spreads, looking at the techniques that have worked for them, I think there are some models there and some answers to getting people excited about giving.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I would also say that those of us in the development profession may bear some of the brunt of the responsibility for this, because we've spent the last several decades focusing on major gifts. The total net dollars are going up. Major gifts is where it's at in that regard, but I think in some cases we may have neglected the importance of that annual fund, the importance of that pipeline. And we're finding that a lot with our clients. We're coming in and they're saying we need new donors. And they're really looking for not just new big donors, but an expanded donor base. And it has a number of positive effects when they're able to expand their donor base. Obviously, that's a bigger pipeline, but also your point about how it affects our democracy. When more people are involved in your organization, you're a healthier organization. When more people care about what you do, you have more constituents and you have more influence as an organization. And it also has a positive effect on your top donors. We're seeing this a lot too. Mm-hmm. We're coming into capital campaigns where it's the second or third time around for an organization, same people sitting around the table, and the first thing they tell us is, I can't be in at the same level I was the last time, or I can't be in for any more. So if they're going to increase their budget, they're going to have to go somewhere else. And they get a lot of comfort seeing new donors come in the pipeline. So it's an area people need to.
And it's also important to reach these diversity and inclusion goals that we were just talking about. As you try to broaden out, the country has changed in terms of its demographics. If we're not doing more to bring people in, then you're not having a more diversified donor base either.
That's right. And you mentioned some new tools and some new techniques. I mean, what we're seeing online with online giving, what we're seeing with technology and the ability to really personalize asks and pay more attention to who your donors are and what it is they're looking for. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface in that area, and I think that's something that we all need to be paying a lot more attention to. That's how we're going to get that back. So let me jump to the opposite end is increased organizational giving. Now, maybe you had mentioned this, that you were seeing this among your Grantmakers.
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, and we do an annual survey of giving of all of our members as well, and I think that, one of the ahas in a good way was as we did our survey of the last year's giving, what we saw was a 23% increase in giving by the institutions and organizations that are members of our organization. And so, though we talked about the decrease in donors, individual donors, we saw an increase there. Now, some of that increase was coming because assets increased as well for those. But even when we looked overall, there was actually a very slight decrease. There was a 2% decrease in overall assets of the organizations that actually completed the survey, yet there was a 23% increase in giving.
Wow.
And I think that some of that really talks about even rethinking some of the grant-making strategies and some of the priorities and recognizing as we partner differently in community that I may still have to give in those spaces when some things aren't. And so for us, we saw that as a really good step. Don't know that that's a trend in that process, but the encouragement around that, and clearly we talked about it at our annual meeting here of what does that mean. I think the interesting thing is even in looking at those that were surveyed, they actually, in talking about next year, which is this year, they actually saw and felt that there was going to be even more increase in their giving. They felt more passionate about what was happening. As I said, racial equity is a huge part of what those members that are here, many of them are focusing on. And so it's an issue of equity, and it's an issue of making sure that this is working. And so I think that's one of the things that I think is important to bring up and to lift. As we talk about, it's not just the mega givers that are out there. There are some very solid institutional philanthropic organizations that are also stepping up and looking at prioritizing and what they're doing in those communities.
So is it sustainable?
Who knows that answer in that process, but, I think what you find is that people really are talking about how do I strategize to really do this. I don't think that there's a question of can we in any way take over and make amends for what might be happening on the other side of individual donors. But I do think that there's a real commitment to say that we are going to make a difference in the places and with the causes that are important for us and in our community. And so I do think that mentality is sustainable. Yeah.
That's great. And we had talked before, Stacey, about the growth of family foundations, where a lot of what used to be individual giving is now foundation giving, and how that changes the way people give. When they get more organized with their giving, they get the family around the table, decide what they're going to do. They tend to come up with priorities, be a little bit more strategic. It also means that the nonprofit has to jump through more hoops, proposal processes and other things, but that seems to be
And then the answer to the sustainable question, the idea of whether foundations are going to give more than the 5% or do those kinds of things, I think that's an open question. But the transfer of wealth is here, and we are. So I do think we're seeing, whether people choose foundations, whether they choose to do these LLCs that some of the high-flying folks are doing, whether they put money in DonorAdvised Funds. I mean, the forms that they use are different, but we do see more money is flowing in. I think that trend is going to continue in a pretty huge way, and that's why we see these incredible things. We're working on the 20th edition of our Philanthropy 50, the people who give the most to charity, and I can already tell you that the top 5 probably are going to have given at least $1 billion or more, at least one of those people is to bequest. Those things are happening, and there are big dollars flowing, and I just think it's been predicted for so long, but we are starting to see that in a big way.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Which is why planned giving is important. So keep thinking about that.
It is a good point, and I think it's also another one of the trends because many organizations now are putting legacy efforts into their organizations and looking at how does planned giving become a part of how we do what we do. So I agree with you on that as well.
Such a good point, and it's really not. I think a lot of development professionals who don't have background in planned giving think that someday they'll start that, or someday they'll hire a planned giving office or whatever, and it's really just another ask. You don't have to be it doesn't have to be all that complicated. Most of it comes through bequest giving anyway. You don't need to know all the details of planned gift estimates. You just have to ask, would you consider our organization part of your legacy? Would you consider putting us in your will?
And talking about how other people do it, the local public broadcast station here in Washington is repairing its tower, and it sent a message about the fact that it's doing that, and it said, paid for by a bequest from a school teacher. And I just thought that was a brilliant way of reminding us all that really urgent, important work came from somebody who did some good legacy planning work.
That's fantastic. Yeah, when I worked at Children's Hospital, one of our best bequests came from a nurse who had worked there all her life and just was putting it away and gave them $800,000. Where did that come from? So everybody can be a philanthropist. Well, speaking of family foundations, then there's, I missed one. The growth of donor-advised funds. We can't not talk about donor-advised funds. These things just keep coming up. And Stacey's given us some tips on what we should be doing about donor-advised funds.
First, to remember why they're so important. Fidelity Charitable gave out more money last year than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now, that's an aggregation of lots of different people making those decisions versus the Gates Foundation being a much smaller group of people. Still, the power of those donor-advised funds, and that's just one of the organizations that offers them. There's just a ton of money going into them. Tax reform did cause a lot of people to put money into their donor-advised funds. They haven't necessarily taken it all out yet. They haven't planned. The key to thinking about donor-advised funds is just to do all of the regular donor cultivation that you normally do. It is fairly affluent people who often have these funds. Just assume they have them. Make it easy for them to be able to say, I'm going to respond to an appeal through my donor-advised funds, remind them that they can, help them through it. We all need to accept that that is going to be a continuing way. Certainly a lot of fundraisers have said that they don't like donor-advised funds because it's harder to figure out who the people are. It's true. It's more challenging, but we just have to learn to maneuver through it. And the organizations that have done that and have put more of a focus on it are doing very well in getting big gifts. Oxfam just got I think it was a $7-figure gift. They don't usually get that kind of thing through a donor-advised fund, through cultivating, making sure that people knew that it was a possibility. The other thing we see some groups doing is really tracking the behavior of donor-advised fund donors, tagging them, making sure we know what they're doing, what kind of appeals are they responding to. They are a little bit different because they have put this money into their funds. That means that they probably don't always want to have as many appeals coming out to them. They want to be a little bit more removed. So you have to treat them differently. But tracking their behavior will help you figure out what's working for your organization. So I think it's incredibly important to talk about these things, remind people that the money sitting in their funds isn't doing any good. It's getting it out the door. That's the key that the nonprofit can play, saying, how do you use this in a great way to help society? Yeah.
One thing that's helpful is even knowing the rules. I think for us in development, knowing
the rules are complicated.
What they can and can't use a donor-advised fund for. They can't buy a table at your gala. Anything that has any benefit back to the donor, they can't do. They can't do legally binding multi-year pledges. Now, there's some question about what that actually means.
There's a way around that. Yeah.
There are ways around that, but they need you to be able to verify that this is. So your multi-year pledges may have to come one at a time, and you need to work with people on that. You're a really good point about reminding people that this could be applied to that. Paying attention to who among your donor base have them. Once they do use something from the donor-advised fund, then you know that, and recognizing that that's an opportunity. It also means that they don't necessarily need to give at the end of the year. They usually put money into the donor-advised fund at the end of the year, but you don't have to wait till the end of the next year to get it. You can.
Yes, now is a great moment to seek those.
And frankly, as somebody who has one at the local community foundation, we keep forgetting that. The money's up. We already donate the money. We could go ahead and turn around and give it to the charities we said we were going to give it to now, rather than making them wait for it when we get around to thinking about it later in the year. So that's, I think, an important consideration.
No, I mean, I think it's another important resource that's sitting out there, and I think people need to better understand how to use it, but also how to access and how to actually approach those that may, in fact, have a donor-advised fund. So I don't think that it is common knowledge. When you're talking about this within the nonprofit space, that is another fund source that's sitting out there.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I want to do is put in a plug for the local community foundations.
Absolutely.
Because this is where a lot of the donor-advised funds are. We talked about Fidelity. A lot of people do them through their broker, but the local community foundations are doing them, and they are paying a lot more attention to what's going on in the community. What I found is they're very informed about issues in the community. You talked about systemic change and collaboration. They're all over who's doing what and who's being affected. Their donors are asking them that. Yeah. I was meeting with somebody from the Dallas Foundation just last week, and she said, and I asked her for advice. She said, people should get to know their community foundation. Make sure we know who you are. Make sure we know about the work you're doing, because our donors are asking us for that, and we can refer them to you. So you can't go to them necessarily asking for money, although many of them do have discretionary funds, and if you fit into the discretionary fund, that's fine, but they tend to be smaller. The real money comes from their donors. They're a great broker in that. So changing demographics. The tide keeps coming in on us, no matter what we do about it, you know. First of all, generational changes. I couldn't resist a little okay boomer note here, because you were talking about the transfer of wealth, and we're seeing that a lot with our organizations. Some of the key donors, stalwart donors for years, are passing the baton to the next generation, who may or may not care about the charity that was mom's favorite. What are we seeing with generational change?
Yeah, I think certainly the causes that are of interest to a younger generation are different. You know, I mean, they're obviously concerned about things like climate change, diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are the things that they've grown up with thinking about all of the time. And so they may not have that same loyalty to the college or hospital or those kinds of things. Not to say that they aren't giving to those things, but they're interested in different kinds of things. So for groups that feel that they haven't gotten as much of a chance to get the dollars, I think it's a great opportunity for groups that have been shortchanged a bit to be able to get the attention of these younger donors. In the issue that we just did, one of the things we profiled was a young woman who started her first charity when she was 13. She did another charity when she was in her sophomore year, and now she's a senior getting ready to go to Stanford, and she has a third nonprofit. So these, you know, we had all predicted these things about the generation that was coming behind the millennials, but they are super engaged, and they are very impatient. Greta Thunberg is only one of them. You know, there are a lot of people like that. So, you know, their advocacy, we hope, will then also lead them to want to give charitably as well. I think that's a habit that we need to start thinking about a lot more, because given how interested younger people are in a really wide range of causes, we need to task them to think about what that means, that it means about giving as well, that these things don't just happen by running protests, but you need to run more sustained efforts.
Maybe you're seeing this among your members?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, a couple of things that are interesting is that, you know, when you talk about the transfer of that wealth, it also can impact communities that were receiving some of that good, because the next generation isn't necessarily in the same place that the parents were, and don't necessarily want to invest back in those spaces. And so I think that's one of the other changes that you're seeing, that some people are seeing with those traditional spaces and places that they had been giving gifts and getting gifts from. And so now as it transferred to a different generation, they may be across the country and they may want to invest over in that space at very different causes than the parents or the grandparents invested in. And so, they're very independent into thinking of what it is that we may want to do or not do. I think the other part when we talk about that change is, I do think that there is a slower pace at which, some of the Generation Zs and Xs and even millennials are coming to it. I mean, they actually are coming out of school. Many of them are still staying at home for a few years. They're delaying family. They're delaying, in fact, their workplace. And so those milestones, oftentimes children are the things that get you engaged with giving. Yep. And now they've been delayed. And so with that, it may take a little more time to get them there. I think the other part about it is it's about technology. And so you've got to be able to reach them through technology, receive from technology, and if that is not a comfort space, then that's going to be a gap.
Do you have members who are passing the baton in family foundations? You have new
absolutely. And so again, I think that And so within families themselves, they're also having those conversations around that. And so what you see is also some more diversity of what we are going to support as that is happening as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think they tend to see things in a more connected way. That's why you see all this emphasis on system change, you know, is about, you know, we can say there's concern about climate change, but really it's about the economy in certain places as well. You know, people see those things, and I think the grant making is starting to reflect those connections.
Absolutely.
And it also connects with something that we see where a lot of our organizations feel like their boards are too old, their members are too old, and they're going back to the well too many times. And a lot of them, their donors are saying, "Go to my kids, get my kid on the board," or you know, and they're working actively to get the next generation engaged and involved. But as you said, they're delaying their lives, and things are taking a little longer to get involved in things like that. So we have another interesting trend happening this year. What is that about? What's going to happen with this new presidential election? This is something that we're always obsessed about here in Washington. I think the rest of the country doesn't worry about it. But 2020 is an election year. Last cycle certainly had a pretty profound impact on a lot of our sectors and a lot of the giving. I know here in Washington, the data show that election cycles and presidential election years don't affect giving. We find that trend isn't necessarily the case here in Washington. A lot of our best donors are all in on campaigns and all in on something else, and we can't get their attention either as donors or as leaders for volunteer initiatives. So I don't know. What do you think, Katie? What are we going to see?
Again, I mean, this is a unique part of the country, and I'm originally from the Midwest in that process. But I will say that, in election years, there is attention to the election, even whether it's at the local level or the national level around that. And so, there is this new attention to giving to those efforts in that process. And so that does redirect some of what's happening. And particularly in this region, no one will tell you that an election year does not impact giving. It does. And you almost prepare for that. People start talking about it a year out. Well, next year is going to be an election year, or, as we're getting into that process. So, I do think that there's clearly an impact as it relates to philanthropy. And I think it's like everything else. It's about preparation and thinking about it. And, but there's some big changes that are happening. And there's some big dollars that are going into elections.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the thing that is different about this election is really attention is so focused on it, and it is at every level. But I think it's harder for nonprofits to get their messages out, especially if it's not pegged to whatever is being talked about at the moment. And, as we see this fast-paced news cycle, we see people being diverted into other things. It's just hard to be able, your local news organization probably is impacted by the many changes on journalism, but also the fact that if they have, enough reporters, they're not able to cover the things that they used to cover. So finding ways to get your story out in different ways, I think that's what is going to be really important this year, just because the traditional sources aren't going to pay as much attention and people are distracted. So you need to realize that, how do you get your message across? We published a piece yesterday by folks at the National Council for Nonprofits, and one of the things they did urge was, for everybody to take the opportunity. There's going to be so much campaigning out and about. Candidates at all levels are visiting communities that they don't usually get to in this kind of a year. So it is a great opportunity to call attention to what's going on in the nonprofit world, take advantage of the fact that they're holding forums, they're doing those things, and talk about the issues and try to have, you don't have to be partisan about it at all, but recognize that there are conversations about important issues. Nonprofits should weigh in and have a very strong presence. Absolutely. That will help people realize what they're doing in the community and why they need help. So I think trying to take that as an important moment, that's another topic I would put on my board agenda if I was running a nonprofit this time. But what are the things that we can do, and can we engage in a specific way? And it's a great thing, obviously, for donors to nonprofits. They often are the donors to campaigns. They have a lot more sway. Get them to talk about the issues that really matter.
I'm really glad to hear you say this, because I had this very conversation with a client last week. They're about to launch a big initiative, and they were thinking about the timing of this launch, and they've got some things to do, and they want to get their ducks in a row, and they said it might slip to fall of 2020, and their board said, if it's after September, forget it. We're going to get buried in the election noise. this happens to be a science-based organization. And I said, you can actually be part of the conversation. A lot of your donors are upset about the fact that they have to justify science and that we're not using enough science to make decisions in the public policy process. So maybe it's a good time for you to get involved and step in. So I think you're absolutely right. Don't lose the opportunity.
It may be one of those times when you can get your voice out, because many times those that are trying to be elected in that process, they are looking for those opportunities to engage around causes. And so being there at the many assemblies that are happening, and that getting that voice out, talking about those causes, educating the public around it, it actually gives you a different platform during this period.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Molly, how are we doing with questions? I think we've covered our main issues here. I think we'll turn it out to any questions that people have. Of course, I don't have my...
Great. We do have 2 questions so far. Our first is, okay. Is there a tool to search for a donor-advised fund online?
No, but there are tools to help you learn more about donor-advised funds. We have some on our site. All of them, Fidelity, Vanguard, National Philanthropic Trust, all of those places that offer a lot of them have a lot of information about how to reach donors. But one of the reasons fundraisers don't like donor-advised funds is because, you don't have to disclose anything publicly. So there isn't a way to search. Now, one thing you can do is at the community foundations is see who is making gifts, and sometimes they associate their names with it. Organizations like Fidelity say that 90% of their donors want their names attached when they make the gift, and so, that they are passing along the name, so it is important to watch for that. But that is one of the challenges, is there's not the directory like there is with the foundations where you can go and find them. So it is more like individual research where you have to, think about the research you would do on another affluent donor.
And then a follow-up to that would be, what about corporate giving? Is there a tool for that?
What's the question? Is there an online tool to help with corporate giving? I mean, there are a lot of corporate giving directories. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes,
it's similar to the donor-advised fund question, just asking about corporate giving and finding those available.
Yeah. Some of the associations that represent companies that give, CACP is one of them. They have a lot of information about that. The Foundation Center has information about corporate givers, and that information tends to be available. But that gets to sort of the whole transparency of donors. There aren't, again, requirements except for companies that have foundations. They have to disclose just like any other foundation. But there's a lot of corporate giving that comes through the marketing department, that goes through the regular philanthropy, and unfortunately they don't have to talk about it, so you do have to do more research in that area.
It's interesting you talk about corporate giving, because that's an area that we've seen transform over the last couple of decades as it's become much more strategic. Some people feel like corporations aren't giving as much, and it depends on who you're talking about. I mean, there's some challenges with globalization. There's challenges with companies moving out of communities, so you don't have the local corporate headquarters the way that you used to, but they're very much giving in areas where they work, whether the headquarters is there or not, following what the employees are doing, and being a lot more strategic about whether or not it matches up with their corporate interests. One thing that we've seen with corporate partners is they're asking us to do more than ask them for money, and to be a good partner. What are the problems you're trying to solve with their money, and how can they help with that? I was working with an international disaster relief organization, and one of their board members was on FedEx, and she said they're coming to us for money to help them with logistics. She said, we think we do logistics pretty well. That's kind of what our business is. Nobody's asking us for any advice on how to actually get the supplies there. They're just asking us for money so they can use their system. We'd like to help them make their systems better. I think that's something we're seeing more of, is thinking about corporations as partners in the process, not just as checkbooks that will help you pay for the process. And regularly, I think donors are seeing the same thing. We're seeing almost a venture capital approach to some of the larger donors who they want to invest in your organization, but they want to know that you're going to make a difference, and maybe they need to sit on the board so that they can see, you know, and that comes with its own challenges, but people want to know what to do with it.
Yeah, that whole concept of what happens from a corporate perspective, that, you know, corporate social, now they're calling it more corporate social impact. They've gone past responsibility. It's about impact, and saying that with that, you know, there are a lot of, whether it's hands-on volunteering, whether there is skilled volunteering that we can do in that process, but there clearly is different ways to engage, and major gifts that you can, if you're looking at it really much more globally, about how we can partner with you to get this done. So we clearly are seeing a big increase in those corporations that are looking at, how do I engage all of my employees also into this support, which can be as valuable at times as the financial support that we're also giving in that process.
Right, sure can.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
We're also seeing, go ahead, Molly.
Oh, sorry. Just another question. This person said that I recently read that boomers are using social media more frequently than younger generations. What do you think about that, and are you seeing that as well?
I think they're talking about Facebook, social media. Facebook more than the younger generation. Where there are tools we don't even know how to spell.
That's right.
And, you know, they're using the tools that we can't find.
That's right.
You know, but I don't know. Are you seeing anything with?
Yeah, you know, I definitely think that it is not a good idea to say that it's only young people who care about technology. Yeah. It is all people. I mean, we all, I think most of us do our own giving online, and we expect those systems to keep getting better and easier and more seamless. You know, and you know, we all expect an experience that's like Amazon, and unfortunately nonprofits can't afford that kind of thing. So I think sometimes by catering to what we think are, this is what will help young people, is honestly it gets to the boomers and to others. And so we shouldn't necessarily try to think about it as being just about young people, but about how do we keep up with the way people are changing their lives. And, you know, that charitable giving isn't something people wake up and say, I want to do it in the morning, you know. I mean, it needs to be integrated into their lives, and we need to find ways to do it. So everything we can do to make it more seamless, to provide the kinds of campaign information. We've seen a lot of experimentation with text messaging that is working. People were afraid of it for a while and thought that that would be too intrusive, but people are willing to give that way. So, you know, I think there are experiments to be done that, you know, will help. At the same time, people also want to connect in person and want more opportunities to do that, and through their nonprofit organization is a fabulous way to do it. So I think we need to make technology better for everybody, but we also need to find ways to convene people of like interests and like causes. So, you know, I think organizations that do things like the Jeffersonian dinners, for example, where they gather people to talk about a particular issue or cause. People are hungry for that kind of conversation, not the rubber chicken kind of dinners, but really just sort of say, you know, how do we connect with the people who are running the programs, who are doing the work, and getting more engaged in that. So I think we need to look for opportunities to do that as well.
I think a lot of nonprofits and corporations too think of social media as one thing, when in fact what we really need to do is understand the different tools, understand the audiences they're talking to, and understand what they're being used for. Because I think part of what's in the question is you'll see older generations like using Facebook for political activism and maybe for fundraising around birthdays and causes and things. My kids don't use it for that. They're just like, no, you don't use Facebook to be political. In fact, they don't use it at all anymore. And when they are connecting with their friends through Instagram or Snapchat, it's not to fundraise for their favorite cause. So how do we engage them where they are in things that matter to them and things that matter to us, so that you then have them, you know, we know that people, they become engaged, they become volunteers in some way, or can we engage their collectivism? Again, I think a number of organizations seem to have been very good about engaging me through text messaging for advocacy. And maybe once a year they might ask me for money, but what they really want is, we want your vote, we want your weigh in on this, we want you to say that this is important to you, and I don't mind getting the message.
The crowdsourcing part of that process, but a big part of that technology integration, and I agree with you, Stacey, going across, it doesn't matter who it is. It also is about time and resource. your most limited resource is your time. And so people are very interested in looking at how are you best using that. And so I will come in and engage with you, but I want to make sure that it is a valuable use of my time. And if what could have happened with an online connection, then by all means, please let it happen in that way. And I think it's important for us to be thinking about it in that regards. It's not just one way to do any one thing in that process, but really kind of measuring and managing and thinking about, how am I using the valuable time resource that someone to get at, whether it's their treasure or anything else that they can give. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're at the top of the hour. I just want to ask you one last thing. 2020, good, bad, ugly, what are we looking at?
I'm feeling good about it. I'm an internal optimist, so I'm feeling good about it. But I do think that it's one that you've got to work at. You've got to be cautious. You need to be resolute in what we're looking at doing in that process. And I think very, very purposeful. So for me, that gives hope in what we can do.
Great. That's great. Thank you.
I agree. It's an exciting year. I mean, the economy is very good, so it should be very good for nonprofit organizations. And in some ways, because of the presidential election and all of the issues that were being discussed, they are front and center for nonprofits. So I think if they can seize this opportunity, this is a fantastic year to get more of their issues in the public forum. So it's time to seize the moment. And I will put in a plug, though, to remind you to prepare for things like the recession and to talk about those things. While these times are very good, let's prepare for some of the things that might go wrong.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for your time. Thank you all for giving us an hour of your time. We hope we made it worth your while. And we've got some follow-up information here. If you want to contact any of us for follow-up questions, feel free. And we look forward to talking to you again next year.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, absolutely.